Welcome, everyone, to episode 9 of the De facto podcast. My name is Anthony Ballas, and today is October 17th, 2023. I'm joined by Dr. Julie Carr, professor of English and creative writing, and the chair of the Women and Gender Studies Department at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Dr. Carr is the author of 12 books of poetry and prose, including Climate, which is co-written with Lisa Olstein in 2022, Real Life and Installation from 2018, Objects from a Borrowed Confession from 2017, Someone Shot My Book from 2018, and Notes on Violence from 2010, which, if I'm not mistaken, will soon have a second printing this year.
Yeah, re-released, by Omnidawn.
Yeah, great, in a couple months, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, well, many other works, I should mention, including Rag from 2014, Think Tank from 2015, and with Jeffrey Robinson, Dr. Carr co-edited Active Romanticism from 2015 from University of Alabama Press, and your co-translation of Leslie Kaplan's Excess, The Factory, was published in 2018 by Commune Editions. In addition to these publications, Dr. Carr, along with Tim Roberts, is also the co-founder of Counterpath Press, Counterpath Gallery, and Counterpath Community Garden in Denver. And I will make sure to provide links to all of the above in the description accompanying this episode. Dr. Carr, it's great to finally meet you face-to-face, in a way, face-to-face. And thank you for taking the time to discuss your work with me and to our listeners and viewers today.
Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to talk to you, having been following your interviews with Gerald Horne and just sharing thoughts with you via the horrendous platform that we're both on.
Right. Yes. That is, I guess, how you and I connected, was through that horrible unnamed platform.
Yeah, we mention it. We won't.
But
it doesn't really have a name, and we won't stoop so low as to say
exactly. But thank you for engaging with my work with Dr. Horne as well. And it's great to have you on the podcast that was started because of his work, actually.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah.
There's actually a lot of connections between your work and Dr. Horne's, I think, that perhaps we could get into later on in the interview here. But before we really dive into the text, can you give us kind of an overview of this book, the subject of our conversation today, which is Mud, Blood, and Ghosts, Populism, Eugenics, and Spiritualism in the American West, which was just published in 2023, a couple months ago, by the University of Nebraska Press. This book is so many things. It does so many things, I think. And I don't want to keep babbling on here. I want you to give us an overview. So could you give us an overview and perhaps an insight into what catalyzed or inspired your research into these various topics tackled in this text?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to talk about how it got started. And I usually sort of come in on one angle or another, and that might sort of direct the conversation. So, but I guess I'll say that the book is something of a kind of a memoir, in a sense, though I don't think of myself as somebody that would write a memoir, but in the sense that it's a document of my own process of learning about this ancestor of mine, Omer Madison Kem, who was my great-grandfather on my father's side. So learning about him, I mean, of course, I knew things about him before I started, but I learned a lot more through the research. So the process of learning about him is also the process of learning about a lot of other things, because he was involved in a lot of different movements or events, I guess you could say, national historical shifts that in order to understand him, I need to understand those. So there's a kind of like, I don't know, epistemology, I guess you could say, of the book that is just really about that process of discovery. But the book is also dealing with some very relevant, I think, to us topics now. So settler colonialism, for sure, central, the question of land, the question of property, the question of the movements of peoples, forced migrations and not forced migrations. That's a major theme. And then the question of populism. He was a founding member of the Populist Party, which, if people don't know, was really the only sort of semi-successful or short-term successful third party, political party in American history. And that, the Populist Party, which was founded in the late 1880s, beginning of the 1890s by poor farmers in the Plain States and also in the South, as a kind of a protest party to both Republican and Democrat parties. And so he was a founding member of that. So the book is also dealing with the question of, what is populism? What was it then? What was it to him? What kinds of possibilities or hopes does it open up? And what kinds of problems does it introduce? And of course, there's parallels that are made. And of course, I was drawn to think about him as a populist and think about populism because of Trump, because the book, I started researching and writing this book in 2016. So Trump is, coming on board and becoming part of our lives, and everything that surrounds Trump and the whole sort of concept of the populist movement that is Trumpism. So that was a big motivator, was that election, and my desire to understand, kind of what is in my family in relation to populism and also in relation to settler colonialism. So also, I'll say that 2016 is the summer of Standing Rock. And, you live here, I live here. Standing Rock was a huge event, for everybody, I think, across the nation who was aware of it. But also, I think very much so for Western people, for people in the West. And so it was a really important movement. I was following it. I was learning a lot through it, reading a lot, but also feeling like, I wasn't exactly called to go. I mean, I thought about going, and friends were going. And, I talked to Native friends kind of about that, and, should I go? And, it was sort of like, well, why would you be going? What would you be bringing was the question that was asked of me. I thought, well, there's things I can bring, I can do things, but I also thought maybe more important from my place, from where I sit, was less about going there in person. I mean, I could donate, I could send money, but was more about thinking about what that movement was asking me to think about and asking me to take a real assessment of. So, of course, that's my own family settler history, but it's also like our contemporary relationships to the land and to property here where we live, wherever it is that we live. And so these were maybe the two biggest motivators, was the question of populism and the question of that settler history in my family. So I knew that this great-grandfather was a homesteader, so I was like, as a child, I was given the stories of like the covered wagon and the cross, all this stuff, the sort of Laura Ingalls Wilder version of things. And, it was part of our mythology. And so that was something I knew. I knew about him as a populist. It was something that, I grew up in this really progressive, liberal family. And so some of his speeches, some of his sort of outcries against capitalist greed or monopolies, or arguments for the rights of workers, like these sorts of statements were kind of a little bit in circulation, and something that we were proud of. So these were the two things. But in addition, I should say that it's important to note that he left behind a 2,000-page autobiography. So this is the grounding archive for the book. And of course, I did lots and lots of other kinds of research. But this is the text that, obviously I had to keep going back to. I mean, he was quite the writer, and that document was not digitized. It was sitting in a library in Creighton University in Omaha. So when I first started reading it, I had to go there. Nobody in my family had ever read it. And I think there's something important to say about that beyond just oh, how great, there was this amazing archive, and what an amazing thing to get to read, which is true, but it's also kind of I guess a symbolic marker, I guess, of a certain kind of privilege, right? That I have an ancestor that not only could write down his whole story, but also would, like thought of himself as important enough, believed that he was important enough, and that his story was important enough to be passed down, and that was reinforced by, his life experiences. So that, and then, the fact of it being in a library, in a university, now, of course, I guess in a certain way, anybody who wanted to could read it, just as many digitized things you could sort of get access to, but it's only a sort of, you can't really, you have to have some kind of, usually some kind of a university affiliation or something like that to get access to this stuff, or you have to know what to do to ask, and, and so, that sort of way that I think archives or education, or formal education, I should say, like certain kinds of education are set aside, or kind of in privileged spaces, or not accessible. These were also themes that run through the book, a sort of question of, who gets to tell their stories, what stories are accessible, how are they accessible, how are they not accessible, these kinds of questions. Yeah, there's a third theme that I'll just mention because it's in the title of the book, and I'm sure we'll talk about, which is spiritualism, and ghosts. But I'll let you say something, and then we can come back to that.
Yeah, the subtitle is very important, and forgive me for not introducing it sooner, but yes, I have many questions about spiritualism and eugenics, which will be addressed very soon. But I just want to back up for a second and ask you about this term populism, because you were spurred to kind of start this research and embark on this family history and this history of populism more generally in the People's Party, as you mentioned, because of the fervor around Trump's presidency and his campaign and so on, 2016. But this term really is kind of difficult to define sometimes. It may even have elusive roots of its own. Can you talk a little bit about what populism really is, and maybe how your perspective on populism, the definition you have of populism, was changed through your research?
Yeah. It's a huge question, and I don't feel like I'm fully able to answer it, because I think populism means different things in different places. And given the scope of this book, I could only do research into kind of what it meant within this context of the U.S. Late 19th century. But I can say that there's so-called left populism and there's so-called right populism. I think one of the things that populism does share, maybe across the board, is a critique of certain kinds of hierarchies. So a critique of the elite, which sometimes might mean a critique of, the specialists, whether they be journalists or professors or medical specialists, anybody who sort of has specialist training and tells you what to think and believe. But that's sort of maybe a certain aspect of populism. But another aspect of populism is a desire to break down political boundaries. So a desire to believe that people who aren't of means, who don't have formal education or high level of formal education, or don't have connections, can still be not just citizens who vote, but political candidates, or actually win elections. So we actually have seen that. Trump is not an example of that, as we know, but other people that ran for office sort of under the Trump banner were examples of that. So in the 1880s and 90s, what happened is that a lot of the history of populism comes out of the sort of history of Western expansion, because the desire of the US government and of the railroad companies in particular was to get people, mostly white people, not only, but mostly, to move west and to occupy the land as a way of pushing out Native people, and being a sort of, kind of avant-garde of essentially a genocidal war. And so, there was other desires that motivated the Homestead Act, not just that, but also the sort of anxieties about urban overpopulation, but also problems with, kind of a laboring class that was kind of coming up in these eastern cities and didn't have access to land and didn't have ways to support themselves. So this is, the story of my great-grandfather. He was in Indiana, and there was no way for him to own property because of some of the laws that had been written about how property could be distributed, essentially. So a lot of extremely poor people in these eastern cities, or what's now considered Midwestern, areas, would move west on the Homestead Act. So the sort of lie that they were fed was that they would get property, they would get free property, essentially, move west, settle, and everything would be great. They would be independent, they would be able to support themselves and their families. It wasn't really a get rich scheme, it was more like a get independent scheme, like, actually survive and fulfill that vision of an independent, farmer, producer. And, of course, the Homestead Act worked for some, but it didn't work for a lot. And the statistics are varying, but I think, it's safe to say that about half the people who moved west into the Plain States, especially on the Homestead Act, failed. So we're looking at like Kansas and Nebraska, and they, other states too, they ended up moving back east, or just having to, go into poverty once again. So this is what had happened to my great-grandfather and many, many, many other people. So they came with this like vision that they were going to become these independent people rooted in the land and make the land their own and subdue the land and make it their own and become part of that land. And instead, they hit a massive drought that lasted for at least 10 years. They hit like really unfair railroad rates and a lending industry that was basically getting them all into debt on like an unregulated mortgage industry. And so many of these people came together, and they came together in things that were called the farmers' alliances. So I should say, meanwhile, in the south of the US, a similar process is happening, mostly among poor Black farmers. So this is sort of, sort of the after Reconstruction. So these people are also unpropertied, often much worse off even than those who had moved west on the Homestead Act. But similarly, they were gathering together under this organization called the Farmers Alliance. And the Farmers Alliances were all over the country, and people would get together and they would share all kinds of information. Often it was like just technical information, like farming. How do you, raise a good wheat crop? I don't know. But also there was a sort of mutual aid process to the Farmers Alliances, the way people were supporting each other, trying to come together to share a grain silo or something like that, so that it would, we could make it better if we shared equipment, if we shared a grain silo. And then a third aspect of the Farmers Alliances was political education. So a lot of people were, sharing some, I'm sure many kinds of literature, but one kind of literature they were sharing was sort of utopian literature, like Bellamy's Looking Backwards and stuff like that. So this sort of growing kind of political consciousness, I guess, among folks, and also this sense of being in something together and having a real argument to make about how things had worked out for them, had not worked out for them, and what could be done about this. And so what basically ends up happening towards the beginning of the end of the 1880s is this growing idea that, it's not going to be enough for us to just try to help each other and make it work. We have to have a political, stake. We have to come forward as a political party. So yeah, that party is first called the People's Party, and then eventually they get kind of named the Populists. And in those early elections, they won a lot of state state and local elections, and really kind of took over the state of Nebraska, which is quite amazing. And then right after that, 2 years later, they ran people for national office for House and Senate. And so, yeah, my great-grandfather went to as a member of the House to represent Nebraska's 3rd district for Custer County is where he was. So that group of populists, like, I guess your question was, how's my idea of populism shifted through doing this research? I mean, I don't think I had a really strong sense of what populism was before doing this research. I think I, kind of like, oh, those populists, they seem kind of horrible and racist. It wasn't very informed. And then I knew that this was something that my great-grandfather had been a populist, and I knew that this was sort of like a cry against, capitalist greed and, these kinds of things. But, kind of where it came from, what it really meant, what it meant in American history was something that I really needed to learn. So that was actually the first thing I did, was just read everything I could about that history. But I think, like, sort of embedded in your question is, do we want to think of populism as good or bad? Is it potentially a progressive movement, or is it only a sort of regressive movement? And I don't think that it's a question we can quite answer. I think that what we really have to be thinking about is, kind of what is when we think about a people's party, what does this group of people mean by the people? That's really kind of the question. And like, how wide is that lens, or is that circle that's being drawn around this question of the people? And being always aware of, like, when is that circle, is it tightening or is it widening? Because it's not static either, right? I mean, it's definitely not static. So, you might have, individual people or groups of people or communities might sort of have a narrow idea of the people. And then that might, for all kinds of reasons, might start to open up and broaden and widen, or the opposite can happen. So I think that populism as a movement, I don't know that it's one thing or another, but it is an idea of breaking down hierarchical boundaries, especially around politics. And I think that just alone is a good thing. So, yeah. So if we just kind of keep it at that, and then we can sort of start asking more pointed questions about what kind of populism are we talking about in different, circumstances.
Which is precisely how you treat it in your book, where you kind of track the way in which that circle is widening and narrowing at certain points, for Chem and for the People's Party more generally.
Yeah, exactly.
And forged out of this Homestead Act sort of era, the agrarian roots, sort of agrarian ethos of the populist movement. But there were other acts involved that took place contemporaneously: fugitive slave acts, Indian removal acts, which you just made mention of. And Chem seems to have known that as a settler, he was dispossessing the native indigenous peoples in Nebraska, for instance. But despite knowing this fact, he often operated, it seems as though he often operated politically as though he was knowledgeable of this fact, and then sometimes sort of disavowed this fact, and then other times fetishized this fact.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about those dynamics?
Yeah. So to start sort of just chronologically, when he went west, which is 1882, he went on a, out of act of like absolute desperation. He didn't even have money for the train ride. He had to borrow that. And what he had been told, or there was rumors that there was land that had been opened up for homesteading in what would have been eastern Nebraska, because, as he writes about, there was a reservation for the Otomazuria people that had been cleared. So those people had been moved off that reservation and moved into Indian territory, like Oklahoma. So this was the invitation to go. was like, you can go, these people have been moved. And they were moved the year before he went. And so now it's open. As it turned out, when he got down there, over there, that particular reservation, being on a river, was not open to homesteaders because it could sell for much more money than the Homestead Act would allow. So in fact, he was barred from that land that he fully believed he was going to be taking from others. So why I say he believed he would be taking it rather than he believed he was somehow owed it, is that when he got to Congress, so now we're 10 years later, the first speech that he made on the congressional floor was a debate that was going on about how much funds to appropriate for the building of new Indian boarding schools. And in this debate is a question of like, well, should we build them far away from the reservation or close to the reservation? And the debate is like horrific to read because everybody's reasoning is we should build them close to the reservation because then the parents will be less likely to be dismayed by the removal of their children because they can, they'll be nearby. So then they'll be more likely to be willing to be assimilated in the ways we want them to be assimilated. Or it'll be, we should move the boarding schools very far from the reservations so that the children have no chance of ever returning home because we want to make a complete separation of these children that we're forcibly assimilating from their families. Okay, I'm getting sidetracked here, but this debate was, one of the first things I read in the congressional record, and it was, pretty horrific. So he gets on the floor and he says, there should be no boarding schools for Native children, for Indian children. They should be educated by their families at home. And we have no place removing children from their families. It's a terrible thing to do. And he goes on to say that, to kind of, build his point, he says that, every single degradation or act of violence between Indians and white people is the fault of the white people. We took their land. We treated them as animals when they're humans. We violated them at every turn for our own benefit and our own good and the development of our own communities. And for that, we deserve, he doesn't say we deserve to be to have violence done to us, but he pretty much does, because he says every single act of degradation is our fault to begin with. So he says all this, and I was like reading this speech and I was kind of blown away. I have to say, like, this is not the kind of thing that people said then, hardly ever, very few people. And then I later find out like who was influencing him, and that was very interesting. But anyway, so after, just literally months after he makes this speech, he's on I should have mentioned, he's on the Indian Affairs Committee. He's been placed on it as a Westerner, which was pretty much standard. He then puts forward a bill, and the bill that he puts forward is to enact the further removal of the Ute people from their reservations in southern Colorado over to Utah. And there's many debates about this. Some would say that some of the leaders of the Ute Nation wanted to do this move for various reasons, but the reasons that he presents to the congressman is that this land would be beneficial to white people. That's it. Just good for white people who want to farm, good for people in, the nearby towns to have these Indians removed. So there's this huge contradiction between what he says, his speech that he makes, and then this act. And there's a couple of other examples where he's promoting settlement over anything like native land rights. So, I think, it seemed sort of, the contradictions were obvious. Here he is, he understands this dynamic, yet he goes forward anyway. It's really not surprising if you think about it in terms of our own lives. you know, every one of us says one thing and does another some of the time, you know, or can't quite fulfill our own highest visions of ourselves. But it gets a lot more complicated. You were asking about the sort of, I forget what word you used, but I think you're asking about the sort of imaginary or the sublimation of all of these complexities or contradictions within his spiritualism. Maybe you're hinting at that. So we
I
can
was
talk.
hinting at it, certainly. The word I used was the dynamics between them, but certainly
Yeah,
they
yeah.
bring us to this idea of spiritualism. If you want to,
Yeah, I'll
go ahead.
transition to that.
Sure.
So, you know, as a spiritualist, he became a spiritualist when he moved to Washington, D.C., or just before. So, you know, when he became a congressman. So these two things were happening at the exact same time. As he's becoming a sort of active populist, he's also becoming a spiritualist. And spiritualism, you know, can mean a lot of different things. So one should just say that there's lots and lots of different kinds of spiritualism. But one of the things that was going on in spiritualism then and still goes on now is this idea of what we call channeling, or having a spirit control within you. And so lots and lots of people had spirit controls of many kinds. And what becomes kind of really interesting if you start reading about it is that a lot of white spiritualists had like either African American or Indian or sometimes Muslim spirit control. So they had these imaginary racialized friends, you could say. But it's even more complicated than that, not just friends. They're like actually in you, they're part of you, they are you. So it's a way of kind of taking that racialized other inside of the self and creating this intimacy. And there's lots of ways to read it. You know, some critics sort of read it as a kind of attempt for kind of a racial crossing or a meeting, a way to kind of, you know, I don't know, handle the problems of racial division somehow within oneself. In his case, and I think in the case of a lot of other sort of people who are involved in, you know, the so-called Indian rights movements, who were white, they, you know, this idea that the Indian is somehow part of you. It's a way of kind of, I think, anyway, the way I understand it is a way of kind of handling that sort of settler guilt, right? Like if the Indian is in me and he's helping me, I should say that his Indian spirit guide was a healer, you know, as a Native American healer. It's like a huge kind of cliched, almost like Disney-like character that he invents, who's like this healer who he fully believed actually healed him of his physical ailments and healed his children. So it's this generational healing that he's kind of enacting or imagining or fantasizing about. I don't know exactly what words to use. So there's this sort of, the way I understand it is this understanding that there's this harm, there's this illness, there's this problem, and that he participated in it, he enacted it, he lived it, this problem of the settler. And yet, you know, by imagining this Indian healer healing him and healing his children, he's curing himself in a sense of that guilt. And as other critics, you know, who write about this have written, you know, it's also a way of sort of making the you know, the Indian becomes kind of a fantasy or racial imaginary or a you know, sort of a ghost that instead of an actual human being with actual human needs and demands. So yeah, very interesting and weird. But I think it almost more than anything else revealed to me what that, you know, how, I guess I would say like how deep and difficult this contradiction was, you know, for a person who professed to believe in a kind of, at least at this stage in his life, this of course changes and we'll get to that, but professed to believe in a kind of egalitarian ethos, you know, and had come from an abolitionist family, you know, there was like uncles in the Underground Railroad and all of this. And so this was his identity, was this sort of spokesperson for egalitarianism in all different ways. but to also be living the life of a settler, and I can't help keep thinking about Israel as we're talking about, like, to also be living the life of a settler and knowing what that means and knowing what that has meant for people that have been removed, it just creates this kind of, what could be called cognitive dissonance, or this internal psychological drama that just plays out through the whole life.
And you're tracking that drama in his writings, Kem's writings, and in the context of this wider spiritualist movement.
Yeah.
Which not only was he exercising to, maybe, as you put it, somewhere in the book, sublimating his settler guilt, finding an outlet for those that internal drama, as you put it, but you also allude in the book to spiritualism itself having egalitarian sort of roots.
Oh yeah.
And maybe we can talk a little. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this central, what I perceive as one of the central questions of your analysis and your writing, which is this question of why is it that some of the egalitarian strivings, maybe, of some of these movements, from populism to spiritualism, they start to take a turn. And you see this, and you're tracking this through Kem's spiritualism, of course, but they take another turn in the early part of the 20th century, having to do with eugenics, forced sterilization. And you're not just indicting Kem, you're indicting others as well. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, somebody asked me this question, sort of, what happened to these movements, in a different interview. And I was like, well, in a word, white supremacy. It isn't really that complicated on some level. I mean, it is very complicated, but on another level, racism plays a role in all of the ways that these efforts kind of fall apart. I mean, it plays a really active role in how the Populist Party falls apart. So I would love to just mention that, because as I mentioned, Black populism, there's a fantastic book by Omar Ali on that topic. I always screw up the title, but it's like In the Mouth of the Lion, or I think it's The Belly of the Lion or The Mouth of the Lion. I don't know.
Well, we'll find the link. Yeah.
It's very, 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 very good, crucial book. And what happens there is, just that there's this, and I didn't do a ton of research into Southern populism because I just simply couldn't, but from what I read from him and from a few others is that, the Southern populists were really moving towards a kind of interracial movement. And this actually was also the case for Western populists, not so much in Nebraska, but definitely in Kansas. So these big populist conventions that were happening in the early 1890s, Black populists were included in those and were part of the writing of the platforms. And there was a lot of sort of performance of interracial alliance on stages. And, you can have sort of a little bit of a side eye on that, like what they were just kind of maybe in a little way sort of fetishizing or trying to harness the Black vote, and maybe, how sincere was it? But, nonetheless, it was definitely this sense of, if we come together, Black and white populists, if we come together and we have shared goals, which they definitely did have some not shared goals, but lots of shared goals, we can defeat the Republicans, in the South, and we can defeat the Democrats, in the South, and we can defeat the moneyed, Republicans. And this falls apart after a very short amount of time. I mean, we're looking at like 5 or 6 years, really not a long time at all. And one of the reasons it falls apart is because the populists, the movement is like, it's maybe not getting off the ground quite the way that they hope it will. And they decide to endorse Bryant for vice president. And in endorsing him, he was a white supremacist. He was a Democrat. They basically sign or throw their Black colleagues under the bus, essentially, by doing that. because there's no way that the Black populace can endorse him. So that's sort of a political example, I guess, you could say, of the movement kind of falling apart around the question of race. But there's another way too, which is that the populists and the Labor Party both, it's complicated. I don't want to simplify it too much. I mean, there was a lot of sort of interracial alliances in the Labor Party too, but there was also exclusion. So there, it's complicated. But one of the things that happens in Congress in 1892 is the passage of the repassage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So it has to be, it's 1882, and then 1892 has to be reenacted. And with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the arguments made to further exclude Chinese immigration and pretty much all Asian immigration are just fundamentally racist. I mean, there's no, I mean, the whole idea that they're just trying to protect jobs or something is like completely undercut. But if you read any of the congressional record around this debate, I mean, it's 100%. The arguments are put forth at least 100% around questions of race. And the populists vote unanimously for the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so there's this way that they, as you were just describing it, like the circle gets tighter, the circle gets wider. So in a certain moment in populism, you can look at that sense of like, maybe if we make alliance with Black voters, or we expand, that circle, we'll have more power. And then there's this retraction, sort of like, we have to protect, we have to try to mobilize as much political power as we can. And the only way to do that is to kind of disregard those alliances across race. So that's kind of a very quick and kind of rough story of that contraction. The question of eugenics, though, is maybe a whole nother, it is a whole chapter in the book, but it's like a whole nother chapter around how, and I think it's maybe unfair to say that populism sort of becomes eugenics. I don't think that that's really true across the board. As we were talking about, populism can go in many different directions, and it does go in different directions for different people. It becomes eugenics for my great-grandfather. And so I can talk about that transition and what that looks like and how these different things are connected to each other for him, because I'm sure he wasn't the only one. But I just don't want to make the mistake of saying, well, populism leads directly to eugenics, because I think that that's not right. So should we talk about eugenics? Is that what you want to do now?
Sure, yeah. I don't want to overstate it, because in the book you definitely qualify how you're writing about your great-grandfather's embrace of eugenics movement and the contradictions that he gets himself into in his correspondence with a longtime friend of his regarding egalitarian politics and this turn toward exclusion, hinging upon race and the burgeoning pseudo-discipline, pseudo-science of criminology in the 20th century, rooted in eugenics, race science. And so, let's talk a little bit about that. What was Kem's, how did Kem arrive at eugenics, and why, and how did it inform his politics, and this question of purity and blood, which is central to your work here?
Yeah, that's exactly. Again, to just sort of speak chronologically, what happened was, he left the Populist Party more or less, or it kind of fell apart, and he left political work and became again a farmer, and this time in Southern Colorado, where he was raising fruit trees and cattle. That didn't last all that long, and eventually he and his family moved to Oregon, to Cottage Grove, Oregon, where he bought with his son-in-law a power company, so an electric company, and became essentially a businessman, you could say, from being a farmer to becoming a businessman. Of course, there's a sort of blurry line there, but owning a power company is very different than trying to raise food on the land. Especially because when you own an electric company in Oregon in the early 20th century, you're burning trees for energy. So that's a side story I didn't get to tell about the lumber industry in Oregon. I didn't write about it. So it's around then, so around 1907, when he first starts expressing these ideas around eugenics. And it makes sense in some way that he might start expressing them in Oregon, because Oregon was one of the most active states for eugenics, along with California eventually. But I think that, some of the research that I did, shows that eugenics ideas were circulating, especially in kind of what we would now call sort of mental health communities or criminological writings, much earlier than sort of 1907 or early 20th century. It's circulating decades before. And the ideas of, the genetics and how it works, or how they thought it might work, those are developing. But the idea that there must be traits, negative traits that people carry, and that if you could only stop them from having children, you could stop those traits from being passed on. These ideas are circulating for decades before eugenics kind of starts to be named and written about sort of technically. So, and a lot of that was happening in, Kansas and Nebraska, Colorado, those states. So there's definitely evidence that he would have been hearing about it and reading about it long before he gets to Oregon, but not direct evidence. I couldn't find quite the smoking gun there. Anyway, by the early 20th century, he starts to express these ideas. And at first, they're sort of ideas about like, kind of whether or not one is born with or learns how to be a kind of a moral person. Is one born with morality, or does one learn it? And he pretty much comes down on the side this one sort of born with good qualities, and you can't really teach certain qualities to people. You have to be born with them. And at first, it's kind of like, okay, we'll think about what that means, but it's like not really expressing, any particular ideas about what one should do about that. But it doesn't take very long. Within a couple of years, he starts to talk about how people should, certain people should simply not have children. And again, with American eugenics, that's usually starts around a conversation around disability, right? So the first conversation will be something like people who have a certain kind of inheritable disease or condition. And of course, they were mistaken about what might have been heritable or not, but of course, so are we. We don't really know a lot about it, but their ideas were very kind of simple, like this person has this, so their children will definitely also have that. But most of the conversation starts out to be around questions of ability, and often around mental disabilities. And then, as you sort of read along in the eugenics sort of story, these categories grow wider and wider and wider. So there's more and more different types of people that are kind of starting to be targeted for sterilization. And that's what happens in his writing as well. So he starts out with sort of like people who are quote unquote feeble-minded, which was a like catch-all term for anybody with a mental disability or perceived mental disability. But then soon it's sort of like, all these sort of categories that they had, the idiot, the moron, the imbecile, all these different sort of categories of disability. And then you start to hear sort of language around people who are poor, people who are unhoused, people who are sexual deviants, i.e., homosexuals, people who are unwed mothers, and then this category of the moral imbecile, or the moral idiot, he would refer. So that category, then you're just like, oh, like literally anyone whose morality you don't agree with. So within a couple decades, his eugenics just becomes like vehemently aggressively supremacist. How that, and again, not just him, like we can talk about US history across, in many, many ways. I mean, these are the 1920s and 30s, and this is a time of sort of growing nationalism following World War I, and Jim Crow, and the rise of the second KKK, and anti-Semitism and anti-Catholicism. So there's all of these movements that are just growing in these decades. But eugenics plays a huge role in all of them. Eugenics is kind of, you could almost say, like the through line for all of these movements. And I guess for me, eugenics starts to become really the ground floor of fascism, or the you can't have fascism without eugenics, and in a certain way you can't have eugenics without fascism, because the premise of eugenics is that there are people who deserve to live. I mean, it really is about living and dying. It isn't just about, oh, well, don't have children, but go on and have a nice life. Because, if you're saying you're not worthy of having children, you're basically saying we just are waiting for you to die. We don't want you to continue on. And so, yeah. So what does this have to do? I think your question, like, we'll come back to the sort of roots question, like, what does eugenics have to do with Plains populism?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, okay. So this is essentially, like, in some ways, I feel like the only really original argument I have in this book, because a lot of this book is gathering, like from so many sources and bringing it together in a certain story. But I think what I came to understand, or came to believe, is that for these settlers, these homesteaders who, as I explain, they arrive with this idea of arriving at independence, it's a very sort of masculine idea as well, and a very American idea of self-reliance. That this is taken away from them. This fantasy is taken. They never had it to begin with. They were poor people. They could not own land. Then they're given it. They're promised it. So it's become a privilege. It's become a sort of sense of I deserve this. And then it never arrives. They never really get it. So their relationship to this land, which was supposed to be the ground of their, American masculine identity, what makes them sort of a valued citizen, is their relationship to the land. But that is always a compromised relationship, partly because they're settlers and they know they're settlers and they know they're stealing land. So, like, what good is that in a certain way as a ground of, like, some, almost like moralistic identity? So they know this problem. Then there's the problem of the land not yielding, of their inability to actually make it work. And that's, not their fault. And then there's the problem of the way the sort of capitalist system is set up to not support them.
And to bring them into debt as well.
Yeah, to actually exploit them. Yeah, not just to not support them, but to directly exploit them to the benefit of, as it turns out, Eastern bankers. Mm-hmm. And if you're them, you'll also say, like, Jewish London Shylocks, because that's a whole other part of the anti-Semitism, which we haven't talked about.
Which you write extensively about in a couple of chapters. Yeah.
More to come. So, that really kind of fractured or compromised sense of self, sense of identity, sense of belonging. Okay, then there's another, I'll finish that sentence, but then there's another aspect to that sort of lack of belonging, which I think is very fundamental to most Americans, which is the sense of, like, we don't really belong here, but also we don't really belong anywhere. There's a sense of, oh, it's great. We move everywhere. We have a road trip. Yay. We go here, we go there. We don't belong anywhere. It's awesome. We're free. And that freedom is, has a lot of, like, charming aspects to it, but it also has a lot of sort of dangerous aspects to it, because we don't have a belief in our relationship to the land. We don't have any reason to believe we have a relationship to the land. We just use it. We just go along it. We just like float along, moving around. And so, what that leads to, in terms of our relationship to the environment. So there he is, and he's one of these people who he desperately wants to have that sense of belonging, and he doesn't have it. So lots of other factors come in, which we can talk about, but I think that fundamentally there's this kind of shift from grounding one's sense of identity and self in the land to grounding one's sense of identity and self in the blood, right? It has to be somewhere. So where is it? And this idea that I am somehow genetically programmed, I want to say, to be an American citizen, and to be, a member of this democracy, this great democracy. All of this gets super racialized, and tied in with this sort of idea of like whose blood is not pure. If my blood is pure because I'm, somehow I have these ancestors, and I'll just say, I'm blabbling on too much, but I'll say this idea of the sort of pure Nordic blood that is essentially American, because it's this fantasy that we got some idea of like democracy from somehow like these German Nordic countries, and it's still in us. And if we're the right type of a person, this is totally still with us. We're dealing with that now. Anyway, so this was the fantasy that the eugenicists were sort of spinning, and that he believed in, and many, many millions of people also believed in.
So a way of justifying these failures and the humiliation of the failure of the populist movement, I think you kind of allude to in the book. It is a very interesting and compelling thesis or argument that you're making. And it's one I've never heard made, actually, in terms of eugenics and the populist failure specifically.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly because, when people write about eugenics, they're often going to be writing about like these wealthy, waspy, East Coast, people, Madison Grant types who, really founded eugenics. They did all the writing about it, or not all of it, but they did a lot of writing about it. There were these books, and they founded a center, and they sent out people to study people. They did all of the sort of infrastructure of eugenics, and they influenced the laws. And so people like my great grandfather, they were just kind of the foot soldiers of eugenics. But I think eugenics, so in a way you could say eugenics makes, how should I put this? Eugenics has meaning for people that's different in different places, just like populism has meanings for people that's different in different places. So I don't know that my argument is like a universal argument about why people like eugenics, but it certainly applies here, in terms of people who really did believe in this myth and really tried to found their identity as and to win over their sort of, not win over, but to win themselves a kind of authentic American identity. Clearly, that's so important for so many people, and maybe in a strange way, more important for rural people or for people in the West than it is for urban people. I don't know. But I think that, that's sort of forging of an identity through this native, this imagined native healer is one way to kind of become authentically American, right? If you are a person who, because of where you live, you fully understand that you are not really authentically American in the same way that a native person is. I mean, you just know that dynamic. You're fully aware of that dynamic. Then what better way to sort of try to become authentically American than to sort of, grab an imaginary native person and put them inside your body? I mean, it's almost like a joke, right?
Right.
And then, that still doesn't really work. And so then this idea of the body holding your Americanness in its genetics, in its blood, there's no one can take that away from you. That's never other. That's just you, So it's desperate in a way. I think I talk about it as a kind of desperate attempt to reground one's identity. And I think, it begs a question for me, which is what the hell is so important about American identity in the first place? Like,
Right.
why do they care? Like, why do we need that? What is nationalism, and why is it so important to people? And I don't know if I really understand that still.
You did talk about in some of the final chapters the context of World War One and this
Yeah.
idea of Americanism kind of growing with Wilson.
Yeah.
And that might, so maybe there's an answer lies.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of like historical political answer to that question. It's not really a deep, like, psychological answer, but it does, it is something, this idea of 100% Americanism and this idea of patriotism. Of course, it's with us from the start. Like, you can't have a Revolutionary War without it, but it definitely gets fed a lot of food through the mobilization around World War One, and that's for good reason, right? Like, Wilson doesn't really have a good argument to make as to why we have to enter World War One. Like, this destruction of like one U-boat, like, it isn't enough, and so he had, the real reason, and at least this is not, historians disagree on this point. I was convinced by a certain group of historians that I was reading, and then I went and read Wilson's speeches, and letters and stuff, and I was convinced that the real reason he entered the war was a financial reason. The country had been in debt, and I'm sorry, not in debt. The country had been in recession. There really weren't enough markets for all of the American factories that were manufacturing stuff. And so there was this need to expand the market internationally. And he made that very clear. Like, we had this image of a straitjacket, like American businessmen are in a straitjacket. Until we can expand into an international market, we're all just going to be constrained. And then so there's this idea of kind of, recession. This is like a standard problem in capitalism. And so that market sort of announces itself through World War One, because, suddenly there's this huge need in England, especially, but also in France, for goods from the US. And so suddenly we're manufacturing all kinds of things, weapons, clothes, wheat, all kinds of stuff are being sent over there. And it's a good deal. And then on top of that, they need money. And who can they get it from but American banks? So that deal gets worked through. And so suddenly, in a really huge way, not just a little way, but like a really huge way, these countries are indebted to us. So we can't send stuff to Germany because of an embargo. So our customers are, England and France primarily. So, the need to enter the war is the need to kind of protect our customer base, essentially.
Which also, which also
But
explains Wilson's other maneuvers in the same era to invade Haiti, for instance, to subsidize the Citibank of New York. We talk about J.P. Morgan.
Yeah, J.P. Morgan. Yeah,
and
it's like Morgan's War. Like,
right.
I think. So, but nonetheless, like, the American people aren't going to go for that. They don't want to enter this war. There's a huge anti-war movement, which is really empowering to read about, like really, really beautiful to read about, and all the different groups of people that were, in that movement. But he's got to do something. So they basically create like a huge propaganda machine, and they had many different wings of it, many different aspects of it. One of the aspects of it was that, I don't write about this, but one of the aspects of this was that they sort of commissioned, especially people who weren't being drafted into the war, so older men, probably women too, to go around and give like little patriotic speeches, in libraries and, community centers, and, just be like a speechifying patriot. So my great-grandfather actually did that work. he went around and gave these
Wow.
speeches. Yeah. So anyway, but this huge propaganda machine is effective, and it mobilizes people not only for the war, like how can we defend democracy? We have to go, we have to be, it's if you don't go, you're not American. There was a huge amount of pressure put on people. And then there was a draft. So this was also a way of kind of justifying this draft. So it works, but it also works to, and part of its, I think, mission is to pit sort of middle class, Americans against labor, because labor is also extremely active in this period of time. Also, the most radical wing of the labor movement is the IWW, and there was a lot of anarchists who were involved in the IWW, and people who were, had of course they had an international perspective and not a nationalist one. And so the pro-war movement becomes also an anti-labor movement at the same time, which it does for him too. An anti-labor movement also becomes a sort of anti-immigrant movement. So these things kind of start to overlap with one another. This, nationalism becomes a kind of white nationalism, which also becomes a kind of capitalist anti-labor position. So sort of shockingly, Omer Madison Kem, who had been this populist, becomes kind of a anti-labor activist in a sense. Which just seems so, you could just kind of say, well, people just lose it as they get older, or they lose their ideals, they become, but as we've been talking about, I think a lot of this has to do with this question of, where does one find one's sense of self? And
especially when it's lost.
Yeah. 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 And so to just come back to you had mentioned his correspondence with his friend Jim Ream.
Yes.
So it's really nice to bring in Jim Ream to all these conversations, because Jim Ream was also a populist and was also a homesteader, and had also a settler in the same part of Nebraska. And they had been friends as young men, and they had helped each other through these very, very difficult years. Jim Ream never left Nebraska. I was thinking about that recently when I was thinking about this, that he just maintained his farming. And that maybe that, in a sense, was helpful to him. I don't know. But he becomes a socialist, so a follower of Eugene Debs. And that shift from populism to socialism, in a sense, makes much more sense, right? It's like, well, that's kind of a logical progression. And there were many, plains socialists. That's a sort of a whole movement, the prairie socialists. But as a socialist, what he offers to Omer Kem when they start to write to each other as older men, they kind of get back in touch, and they start this really intense 10-year-long or maybe even 20-year-long correspondence. And the central conversation that they're having with each other, these extremely long letters that people used to write, is a debate about, what is the future going to look like? And they're facing the Depression, they're looking at sort of the collapse of capitalism, or what they think might be the collapse of capitalism, and what, and urbanization and all of these other problems, and the war. And this debate centers around a question of who gets counted as a person, essentially, who gets to be in that circle that we've been talking about, or whose lives are counted as lives, to quote Judith Butler. And what Jim says, when Omer starts to try to convince him of eugenics, he says, look, I don't know about eugenics, I don't know, but he says, I just have to start with what he calls a foundation, and that foundation is, and I think I have this pretty much right, is all life, human life, vegetal and animal life, is deserves to thrive and is sacred, essentially. And so he just keeps coming back to that again and again. And every time Omer says, well, you know, these people, those people, these people, those people really shouldn't breed, he comes back around to this idea of like all of life is equally worthy of thriving. And what I took from this debate, which was really actually quite heartbreaking, because, you know, I find Kem sort of begging his friend Jim to explain socialism to him. And he keeps saying, just tell me how it's going to work. Just tell me, like, give me the practical details. How is it going to work? How are we going to make this work? I don't think it'll work. You got to just go back to eugenics. And Jim is like, yeah, I don't really know. And what he says is, he says, give the people a chance to be human, and in one long series of experiments after another. And that to me was like everything that I wanted to maybe take away from this project or from this research, because it was this model of living through having this ground floor foundation of the value of life, and that you would constantly be reminding yourself that there aren't some lives that are more valuable than others. You would have to keep reminding yourself of that, like constantly. And that's your foundation. And then from that, it's a matter of experiment. And it isn't a matter of like setting up the plan, because usually when people set up the plan, it goes very badly. So instead, it's a matter of being human in that particular way that he describes, and then trying this, trying that, and working together, because he keeps saying, give the people an opportunity to be human. And it's really the sense of people working together. So, you know, it was heartbreaking to me that my great-grandfather was not convinced, and instead was going in the absolute opposite direction. You know, but I had this moment when I realized that I was only reading Jim Ream's letters because Omer Kem had copied them out. And that this was actually a huge task, because by that time he was like incredibly arthritic and he couldn't even get out of bed. He could barely hold a pencil. But nonetheless, he took the time, which must have been incredibly laborious, to copy out these 20-page letters, like over, you know, there's like 100 of pages of letters. And then at one point he says, to Jim, he makes this joke and he says, I'm copying out your letters for future generations to read, so watch out. And I was like, oh, okay. He knew I was going to read these.
He had the archivist in mind.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, so a part of me thought he was horrible at the end of his life. You know, he was essentially lost. But he did this task, maybe because he knew he was lost, or he hadn't found what he had hoped he would find in any of his ideologies. But he recognized that Jim had found something. I don't know, that's maybe a little too hopeful on my part, but I did have that thought. So it changed a little when I had that thought. It changed a little, this sort of sense of you just wanting to kind of expose him in some sort of aggressive way, you know.
Right. They kind of had a friendly, well, not only friendly, but kind of a jokey sort of
Oh,
way of writing to each other, right?
yeah, they had a very jokey way of writing. They had a sort of erotic way of writing to each other, which I didn't quite know how to take, like, because it was very clear, but it was also like, well, you know, people use words differently then, you know, but yeah, they had an incredible amount of affection for each other.
And just if you have a little more time for two additional questions having to do with kind of legacy of populism, or legacy of some of these ideas in your book as they manifest today in 21st century politics, some of which you've already touched on with reference to 2016 Standing Rock. the candidacy of Donald Trump and so on. In the book, you also talk about, you spend a couple pages, in fact, writing about this John Eastman, who's a name that we get in the news now,
Yeah.
Whether we like it or not, who was recently charged with conspiracy related to Donald Trump's RICO indictment in Georgia. And just a couple of weeks ago, in fact, Donald Trump made the claim, it's familiar to people who know how Donald Trump speaks, that immigrants, quote unquote, poison the blood of our country. This was, oh yes, this was early October.
Wow.
And of course, Eastman shares this view. And these, I'm just plucking two right-wing populists out of that are popular right now.
Yeah.
He shares this view, but in a particular sort of sense, he uses a different sort of rhetoric that you write about, and you talk about his sleight of hand that he really built his career on. I wonder if you could kind of talk about some of these contemporary figures, and maybe Eastman, the Benson Center.
Yeah, the Benson Center. Yeah. I love talking about the Benson Center.
Okay. But are these figures in something like the Benson Center or others, are they keeping a sort of eugenicist sort of ideology alive in some sense, and how and in what form?
Yeah. So John Eastman, for anyone listening who doesn't know, is not like a CU person. John Eastman was employed by CU Boulder in, I guess this is 2019, 2020, those years. He was employed as like a visiting scholar, and they used to call it the visiting, I don't know if they still call it the visiting scholar of conservative thought. Maybe they do, as a title like that. And he was employed by a center on campus called the Benson Center for something. I should know its name by heart. We can put that on somewhere as well.
Sure.
The Benson Center has had this position, this visiting position, and I think they might even have two people sometimes, of people who they bring in for, quote unquote, like academic or intellectual diversity, to bring sort of conservative thinking to campus. A lot of their people that they've brought have been, quite problematic to many of us in different ways. But Eastman is a special category. So before Eastman even came to campus, he came, was hired. He came to give a speech on campus to people, and people who go to the talks at the Benson Center are usually the people who are involved in the Benson Center. So I don't think a lot of other people were there. But I watched the speech on YouTube or somewhere. And in the speech, he presents his theory of the 14th Amendment, which is that the 14th Amendment really didn't mean to grant people citizenship by birth, right? So the 14th Amendment says if you were born on American soil, you are a citizen. And he has this whole sort of argument based on sort of like these readings of sort of like letters between people at the time that states that, well, it doesn't really mean that. And that because his theory is that it doesn't really mean that, he thinks that now that aspect, that birthright citizenship, should be revoked. At this speech, he gives this argument. We can talk about the argument and why it's screwed up if we want, but the language of the 14th Amendment is incredibly clear. So you really have to do a real double take to argue that it doesn't mean what it says. But in this speech, he says, because of this analysis that he's made, he believed that Donald Trump had the right, in fact, the duty, to revoke the citizenship of people who were born in the United States whose parents were not citizens at the time of their birth. That's a lot of people. And of course, given the context of, the history of immigration in our country, that's a lot of people from Central and South America, primarily. And so he nonetheless, gave the speech. There was no real pushback. I think he does this sort of thing where he's like, I gotta go after he gives a speech. I gotta catch a plane. He's gone. So they hire him. And I don't think a lot of people who were not part of that process knew who this person was at all before he shows up. But almost immediately upon showing up, he wrote that sort of now infamous op-ed about Kamala Harris's candidacy as vice president, saying that she maybe isn't qualified or, could not run because her parents were not citizens at the time of her birth. So as soon as that was published, a lot of faculty, were, saw it as a simply racist dog whistle and were calling for his removal or at least sanctioning or something like that. But really nothing happened. So right after that, I reached out to him because I was writing this book and I was like, well, here's somebody who seems to be putting forth a kind of an anti-immigrant at the very least perspective, which is a big part of, 1920s eugenicists thinking was also to limit immigration. So that's another sort of biopolitical move that they're making that's, directly about race and the concept of the pure American blood. We didn't talk about the Immigration Act, but that's okay. So I reached out to him and I said, would you have a conversation with me about this? And he was like, yeah, sure. And then, as I said, we got together and he said, I got 7 minutes. And I was like, oh, well, do you want to, this is probably in October of 2020. And I said, do you want to reschedule? Because if you don't have much time. And he said, no, I'm going to be busy from now until January working on the legal case about this election. And I was like, oh, you actually know that you're going to be trying to overrule the election should it go to Joe Biden. And it was just kind of like, yeah, well, we got to get ready. I was like, wow. So that was illuminating. And I feel like I should have called somebody.
Well, they told on themselves so many times.
I know, that's true. It's like, it wasn't really, but I was like, wow, maybe I should make a call. But yeah, so the whole sort of idea of dismantling the 14th Amendment and disregarding like the reason the 14th Amendment, came to be was to give citizenship to the newly, freed enslaved people. And, so therefore one might imagine that there's a kind of like, I don't know, sort of undercurrent of anti-Black racism also in this desire to dismantle this birthright citizenship, as well as, clearly racism against people of, Latin America. And, I asked him about this directly, and, he just kept saying the thing that you could imagine that he would say, which was, if there were a lot of French people coming to the US, it would apply just as much. I'm like, but the fact is there aren't a lot of French people coming to the US. So given the situation that we're in, I said something like, you could understand why people might think this is a racist position to take. Well, it has nothing to do with the race, blah, 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 blah. So anyway, it was an amusing conversation in a weird way, a scary conversation, an infuriating conversation, because, people like him who put forward these kinds of ideas, they're always going to find a way to sort of slip and slide around, they're not going to say, yeah, you're right. Right. Of course, like you have to be smarter than I am to get them to sort of admit their game. But I think the reason I write about this John Eastman encounter because, because the idea of birthright citizenship and the attempt to dismantle birthright citizenship is, tied into all these ideas about, the racialized other is going to come invade the land. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways the racialized other invades the land is through birth, and so the way that the idea that the immigrant mother is going to have multiple children, and and the racialized male is virile, extremely virile, and so this is a sort of hysteria that gets built around race, which also is built around sexuality. And so, I don't say a ton about this, but I really think we need to notice, I guess you could say, pay attention to the ways that these two forms of hysteria, sort of sex hysteria and race hysteria, dovetail or intersect with one another. So as we try to control women's birth, as we're doing in this country now, women's reproductive rights, it's always going to be in one way or another racialized, and it's too complicated to talk about, in a short amount of time, but I'm just flagging that.
Right. Well, you do spend time on it in the book.
Yeah.
Historically, but you do talk about forced sterilizations in the early 20th century and then up into the present day, in fact.
Yeah.
And so that racialized racialized methods of sterilization have been with us for a long time, rooted in this very context that Kem was writing about and embracing eugenics. And I think that you're right to argue that it's still with us.
Yeah.
And as many of these forms are still with us. In fact, if I could ask you, I have two final questions if you have time.
Sure.
One has to do with the contemporary moment again, but thinking about kind of the age of conspiratorial thinking that we might find ourselves in. A lot of right-wing conspiracies, QAnon, for instance. There's a proliferation of UFO conspiracies that are making mainstream headlines, and ideas of government cover-ups, things that we're familiar with, certainly, but they've kind of come back with a different impact recently. And I can't help draw, in fact, my wife pointed this parallel out when we were talking about your book, which was the parallel between Kem's character, Fleetwind, who is this Indian, phantasmatic Indian character that he conjures to heal his body that you were already talking about, and figures like the QAnon shaman, who has embraced a similar sort of I don't even know what to call it, fetishistic Native American caricature that he wears on the outside of his body.
Right.
Made famous by his ostentatious role in the coup of January 6th. To come back to Eastman. But do you find traces of what you call, and I think I have your quote somewhere, pernicious forms of sublimated guilt that leave the settler conscious clean in the sorts of figures like the QAnon shaman, or we might even just talk about this conspiratorial kind of thinking more generally? Are we going through a new kind of spiritualism today that has ideological, political roots in this era that Kem was writing?
Yeah, I wish I knew more about that. I think that's a really great question, and well, I'll say one thing. I did meet a woman. I mean, there's spiritualism is alive and well. It's a thing that people do, and there's many different strains of spiritualism, and there are now, and some of them, they come from different places in the world, and they have different roots, and I don't want to condemn them all equally or in the same ways, and I think that it's not as if all spiritual practices are somehow appropriative or problematic, and they're not. But this idea that sort of Native people are still sort of stand for some idea of kind of healing or authenticity or both, or truth telling. I think we see that all the time in the ways that kind of white culture appropriates Native cultures, or it doesn't even, it's almost like it imagines Native, because it often these are just completely fabricated ideas. and definitely like Indigenous scholars have done a ton of work on this and are, writing about it all the time. And we could, maybe share some, if you go to my website and you go to the further reading part, there's just a huge bunch of books that you can look at, who talk about this dynamic, from, Philip Deloria on. And I think that that sort of, well, okay, I'll just tell us a story, but then maybe I'll say one more thing about it. I met a woman in Maine who is part of a spiritualist community that has been in Maine, which has been present for, I don't know, like over 100 years. And I went to that community, and met people there, and I write about this in the book, and sort of learn about, kind of how they see their spiritualism and how much has not changed in how spiritualism is represented, at least in that community, and practice, not just represented. But I asked that woman that I met, who was part of this community, I said, are there any sort of native spirit guides that people, what we call spirit controls, that people channel in contemporary lingo? And she said, yeah, there are. And I said, are there any native people who are the mediums? Are any of the mediums themselves native? And she said, I don't think so. So that dynamic of sort of white mediums speaking through, speaking in the voice of native, imagined native people is definitely still very much a part of that culture. And I would imagine for many of the same reasons that it was, 120 years ago, or 130 years ago. It seems like that dynamic is ongoing. And I guess what I would say about that, and I'm not an Indigenous scholar, and I'm not a person who's studied this stuff really, really deeply. So this is just, in a way, my own conjecture, I guess. But I feel like this country is so far away from reckoning with this settler history. It's, the last, whatever, 5 years or so, or 10 years, however you want to count it, there's been an effort made to reckon with the history of slavery. And, it's, as we know, it's like barely a start, and it's really messy, and it's, up and down and incredibly complicated and not satisfying. But it's happening to some degree. But I don't feel like the same thing is happening around the settler history, which is not, it's not as if it's like longer ago.
Right.
It's just more, it's just more hidden, less addressed. No one knows what to do about it, and what would reparations look like in that context, and it's ongoing is the other thing, right? I mean, so are the afterlives of slavery ongoing, and racism, anti-Black racism ongoing, but this settler history has not ended, and it's not being addressed, and almost, I mean, it's slight, tiny things here and there, but like nothing really significant. And so I think when we're still holding that, then it's going to play out in all kinds of ways that are just sort of bizarre, like that QAnon guy, and it just pops up in white culture in all kinds of bizarre ways. So I guess to make full circle, I mean, one of the reasons I even started to write this book was just because I was like, wait a minute, like I would go to Standing Rock and be like, yay, Standing Rock, like I'm the child of these settlers and I don't know shit about it. Like that would seem like the most posy thing I could possibly do, even though I was compelled to do it. So, I just tried to make a start, I guess I would say. And I don't think like this is just a start. This is just a start.
Well, if you'll allow me to say so, it's a hell of a start.
Thank you.
If you are calling it a start, it's really a beautiful book, and it does so many things I already mentioned. It's a family memoir, it's history, legal history, even cultural analysis, some literary and even film analysis, criticism going on, which is something I wish we could have talked about. Your chapter on water and Chinatown, white femininity was fascinating, that whole reading. So I encourage listeners and viewers to go get the book for these and many other reasons. Final short question. I won't take any more of your
I'll
time.
answer short. I promise I'll answer short.
Well, answer as long as you want, but I don't want to steal any more of your time. But I'm just so curious because this work is not unlike anything I think I've ever read. I think I can safely say that I've never quite seen the work of biography and memoir and all of these things, history, kind of arranged in this fashion. And so I'm really curious about how you wrote and how you researched the personal, the political, doing this archival work as an English literature and creative writing person. Who, this, am I mistaken to think that this is your foray into historical writing?
Yeah.
This maneuvering between the biographical and the biopolitical, but seamlessly. It's really something. So I just want to ask you about your process a little bit.
Okay, I'll try to keep it fairly brief. I want to just name 3 books that were really inspirational to me. So Christina Sharp's In the Wake, Colin Diane's The Law is a White Dog, and Brandon Shimoda's A Grave on the Wall. The Grave in the Wall. I always get the articles wrong. So these are 3 books that they're very different from each other. They have different agendas and different even genres, but all 3 of them deal with history, and they bring the self, the self of the writer into the story in ways that, you can see like anthropologists doing, new anthropologists. But they don't just bring like the self, like, and then I went and read this. They bring the like the heart of the self, they bring like their heart, and their imagination and their dream space into their books. And these books I read, maybe a few years before starting to write this. And Shimoda's was more recent, the other 2. And I was teaching a lot of like literary theory for my job, and I just was like, where else is this literary theory going to go other than to come back to sort of bringing accountability and sort of embodiment into the text itself, So that part was almost like a call and response. Like I had been moved by these books, and I wanted to do something that honored them in a sense by also bringing my own accountability and embodiment into the text. So that's almost like an intention. As far as process went, I'll say that, research, this kind of historical research, I hadn't done a ton of it before. Of course, like just like a person engaged with the world, I read a lot of stuff of different genres and all different kinds. But I hadn't done that sort of purposeful, like I am going to now research water law in the West. And if I wasn't so motivated by the larger story, I would have gotten, exhausted by that effort. But instead, I was like completely motivated and excited by reading things that normally would seem very boring. So there was a lot of reading of secondary literature, a lot of historians, and I didn't really know how to do primary research at first, other than like the autobiography itself. So I had to learn, like, how do you find these things? How do you find new, and I worked with librarians. I mean, I asked for a lot of help, and historians. I was like, what do I do? What do I do? How do I find this? And they were incredibly generous. One thing I learned is that I don't think English professors and literary historians are nearly as generous as historians. Sorry to my clan, but the historians, like, they have this sort of sense of a shared purpose, like, together we must find out the truth. And so they are just like, they'll get on a Zoom with you, they'll send you stuff, they'll direct you to archives, and people were like amazing. And I'm very unshy. And so I reached out to tons of people and they almost all reached back. Another process thing though that I really want to emphasize, because maybe it helps other writers, is that the book didn't really come alive to me until I found its music. And that way of describing that is because I'm a poet. But at first when I was writing it, I mean, the research was fascinating, but my own writing seemed extremely boring. I was like practically falling asleep while writing. I was like, wow, this sucks. This is totally boring. I'm like, all I'm doing is like telling what I learned, like blah, blah, blah. And at some point along the way, and I just remember I kind of remember the day where I was like, oh, I just hit a kind of rhythm with the language. And of course it changes, not one rhythm, but like the sense of being in a rhythm or being in the music of it is what allowed the writing to not just be reporting and not just be like, now I'll tell you about this, but actually kind of bring what I mean, I know it sounds corny, but like to bring the heart into it. And so I think a lot of the ways that the chapters sort of work, of like moving between like the now and the story and the history and then the reflection on the history, it's sort of a function of rhythm. It's a function of sort of like the larger music of it. So I imagine that like that kind of way of thinking about writing is just what you develop after a lot of years of writing in the poetry genre.
Right.
But I think it's a helpful maybe thing for people who are working on books and like just feeling like it's painful, the writing is hard, to try to like find your way to something that feels like a rhythm, like in the language itself, not in your work day, but in the language. Right. Yeah,
I appreciate that. Thank you for that rumination on process, because like I said, I have to emphasize again, I've really never read anything like this that can so seamlessly blend your voice and this kind of collective voice with, I guess maybe there's one part of the heart is this populist voice, the egalitarian populist voice, I should add, which you represent in this book in many ways. And then also, you don't shy away from collaborative writing, it seems, anyway, which is something that you don't often find in English literature. Very often is this sort of work. So anyway, we could go on and on. I've taken so much of your time already, but I really appreciate you, everything.
I feel very, very grateful to you for reading it so much and having so many great questions and thinking about it with me.
Oh, the pleasure was all mine, and I hope that very soon I will be able to sit down and write my essay on it.
That would be great.
I'm currently working on.
Thanks.
And but I really appreciate it, Dr. Carr. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.
And we'll be in touch.
See you on the bad app.
see you on the bad app. Yes.
Bye.
Bye.